She was there. Rachel Jr., as she referred to herself, sat curled in the guest chair on the far side of the room, at least 12 feet from the hospital bed where her mother slept. The night before, her mother had respiratory problems from a narcotic which the doctor thought she should take for pain. Around 3 in the morning, she nearly stopped breathing, and so Rachel refused to leave her room until her post op recovery was complete. She stretched her legs across the small ottoman and adjusted the large blue binder in her lap, which contained her entire family tree. She held a flashlight in one hand, and in the other hand, she held a yellow highlighter. She turned the pages one at a time, occasionally highlighting lines of text, seemingly at random. The pages were many, and sometimes she'd pause and study a single page for several minutes before moving on. Then, after suddenly using her highlighter one more time, she looked up across the room at her mother. It was dark, so she used her flashlight, illuminating her mother as she slept. She let the light hover on the old woman's face, then her body. She watched the sheets and blankets rise and lower, rise and lower. When Rachel was sure she was breathing normal, she turned the light back on her work. Rachel turned the next page and began to read one line at a time. She highlighted the name of one of her first cousins who had just had twins. The binder needed updating. This road was quiet. The old couple that ran the campground had said that this little mountain road was the quickest way from Arroyo Seco to Carmel. From there, it was a few minutes to Big Sur and Coastal Highway 1. Many people considered the highway the most beautiful coastline in the United States, paradise. The small mountain road itself was narrow, most of the time only big enough for a single car, which made sharp turns interesting, especially when a cliffside presented itself on the left-hand side. In many ways, it was exactly what you'd remember from an old Disney movie you watched as a child. In many ways, it was precisely what you'd read about in school books or novels about folks migrating from the Midwest to the West Coast during the Depression era. In many ways, it was exactly what you'd imagine when you think of California. The scenery offered the occasional vineyard or orchard, but mostly it was trees, brown grassy valleys, sheer cliffs, and rolling hills. More than once there was a small house, nothing more than a shack, patchwork walls and roofs, dilapidated fences, and sometimes a pickup truck on cement blocks. There were never any people outside, never any wildlife, save the occasional chipmunk or squirrel scurrying across the road. In many ways, it was the ideal place to live, especially if you were presently fed up with society and all of its miserable failures. Chopped pine. It was freezing cold outside up in the mountains on a snowy day in December. Leaning against a tree, half drunk and bundled in several layers of winter clothing, Jimmy watched his friend Charles quarter logs of pine with a yellow-handled axe. Charles was explaining that pine was relatively easy to chop, but Jimmy was only partially listening. He was nursing his fourth can of beer and, at this altitude, was beginning to see glimpses of genuine libation. It was freezing. Even through his gloves, he knew how cold his beer can was. Jimmy made it his goal to remain perfectly still, his arms pressed against his torso, trying to generate, or rather contain, heat. Just then, a small underweight cat walked across Jimmy's boots. The little thing, no more than a kitten, walked across his feet casually, rubbing up against his leg. Its fur was thin, and it didn't have much meat on its bones. Jimmy thought it was strange how the cat didn't really seem cold. In fact, it seemed perfectly content with the weather, prancing gingerly on top of the snow. Jimmy looked over at his friend and asked, "Hey man, this your cat?" Putting down the axe for a moment, Charles turned his attention to the cat and took a good look at it. Then he said, I don't, yeah, I don't have a cat. No, that's not my cat." They watched it walk out into the snow, through the yard, until it jumped over the fence and crossed the street into another house's yard. Jimmy knew dogs walked around freely in those small mountain neighborhoods, but not cats, and certainly not in winter. After all, it was freezing cold outside. Jaywalking. Keeping one eye out for oncoming traffic, Jimmy James stepped off the curb, preparing to cross the street. Jimmy Miller reached out and slapped his arm with the back of his hand. Jimmy James stopped and looked at him. "What?" "The diner's right there," he said, pointing across the street. Jimmy Miller began walking to the corner and said, "Crosswalk." Jimmy James shook his head and proceeded across the street as originally planned. The other Jimmy hesitated, let one car go by, and then jogged after his friend. At the diner, Jimmy James held the door open for him. They both went inside and sat themselves in a booth by a large fish tank. Eventually, the waitress came by and they both ordered coffee. Jimmy James had eggs, bacon, and toast, and Jimmy Miller ordered a Reuben without bread. Jimmy James shook his head and sipped his coffee. He watched his friend stare at the fish swimming around inside the tank next to him. Jimmy Miller noticed him shaking his head and finally said, "Hey man, crosswalks are safe." Jimmy James held up his hand and smiled. "Okay, Jimmy. Christ, okay." The food arrived and they both had lunch. Jimmy Miller ate his sandwich with a knife and fork. Always been yours. She stood next to her uncle's hospital bed, watching him stare blankly into space. She held his old withered hand and said a quiet prayer to herself. Her grandmother had sworn their prayers were, quote, the reason her brother wasn't in any pain, end quote. And by all rights, he should have been. Her uncle had cancer throughout his entire body and it was spreading. But he was in no pain, so he wasn't on any medication. Even still, he had completely blanked out. For 3 months, he just lied there, silent, still, and staring into space. The young girl finished praying and sat down in a spare chair. Then her grandmother, mother, and one of her other uncles came into the room with one of the nurses. The uncle was holding a blue binder, which seemed to be completely full of paper. While her mother and grandmother spoke with a nurse, her uncle brought the binder over to her. He handed it to her and she took it, setting it down in her lap. She ran her hand over the cover of the large book and read the front label. Miller Trinity Family Tree. She looked up at her uncle and said, "Wow, it's so heavy. Did you make this?" He shook his head and sat in the chair next to her. In an old and tired voice, he said, "Me and my brother there, but we've kind of lost track over the last few years. It's incomplete. I was hoping you could take it, maybe help us catch up." She turned the binder, opening it up to the first page of the table of contents. It was a massive book, and as she flipped through the pages, she noticed how the ones in the front were very yellowed and faded, while the ones in the back were less so. Then the man's offer finally sank in, and she looked up at him bewildered. "Me?" she asked. "You want me to take over the family tree? Well, it would be my honor. Yes, thank you." She leaned over and hugged the man with one arm while keeping the binder steady on her lap with the other arm. "There's a lot of hard work went into that thing, a lot of history there too," said the old uncle. "The key is to stay on top of it or it'll get away from you quick. But like I said, you'll have to go back and fill in some of the most recent blanks." Then the old man looked over at his dying brother and watched his sister tuck the man's blankets in so that he was snug. The man never ceased from staring out at nothing. The young girl continued to look through the blue binder. In fact, the book occupied the majority of her time over the next several months. Now he knows. The newlyweds had been in Mexico only 5 hours, and after checking out their condo, they drove their rental into town to find a payphone. They'd been told the townsfolk were indifferent to tourists, but they wanted to spend their honeymoon in a remote location, so they chose a ranchero instead of one of the typical resorts. She was on the phone to her mother explaining they'd arrived safely, while her husband was standing around watching the mild traffic and counting the number of grocery marts lining the main street. There were, oddly, a lot of them. Not only were there several stores all serving the same purpose, but it seemed that every other building was falling apart or completely condemned. As he surveyed the small town, he slowly became aware of a low humming sound coming from somewhere nearby. Then he noticed a cranking sound, And on top of it, he could hear a man's voice calling out in Spanish. Even though he didn't know much Spanish, he could tell the voice was barking orders. He walked toward a half-fallen concrete wall a few feet away. As he got closer, he became increasingly more convinced that this was the origin of the sounds he'd been listening to. Factory sounds, he guessed, but nothing industrial. He stood next to the wall and looked around, noticing it led up to a partial roof which someone had strewn a tarp from, which seemed suitable for blocking light rainfall at best. Then he spotted a hole in the wall and went toward it. When he peered through, he saw several older women sitting at tortilla-making machines. They worked pedals and levers on the ancient machines, which sat atop card tables and workbenches. They worked away in silence as a foreman walked between them, apparently keeping them on task. He was the only male in the room. Looking up, he saw the clear blue sky above them and thought how nice it must be to work outside. Then, remembering the tarp, he reconsidered and thought how perhaps the women may not agree. He thought perhaps they would rather work indoors and how the quality of their working environment could easily be improved. He wasn't positive that all tortillas weren't made in this way, but he was absolutely sure that sometimes they in fact were. When his new bride had finished her call, they went back to the condo and took a nap. It had, after all, been a long flight. Thanksgiving. Late afternoon on Thanksgiving Day, 2001, and Jerry Miller was standing at the front gate of the Memorial Cemetery. Clavon Richards was walking over to him from the parking lot, and when he finally reached them, they both shook hands. Jerry clapped a hand on Clavon's shoulder and said, "Happy Thanksgiving, Clavon." Clavon smiled back and said, "Same to you, Jerry, my boy." As they entered the graveyard, Jerry walked slower than normal, adhering to the older man's pace. They strolled along a cement path amongst the uniform rows of white tombstones which seemed to stretch on to the horizon. It was a dreary day. The sky was gray and full of threatening rain clouds. Even the fallen leaves of autumn had lost all of their color. And although it was cold and damp, Jerry felt like it was fitting for the occasion. Jerry and Clavon made it their routine to meet on holidays and visit the gravesite of their old friend Russ Wagner. Jerry had been neighbors and friends with Russ. Clavon had been long-term business partners with him while selling auto parts cross-country. The two friends walked on, and there wasn't much talking between them that day. Eventually, Jerry and Clavon reached the appropriate site, and they were both a little surprised. Leaves covered the ground entirely except for Russ's plot, where they found a perfect rectangle of green grass. "That's odd," said Clavon. "I'll say," replied Jerry Miller. Almost immediately, Jerry reminisced about his youth, while Clavon's thoughts turned to pumpkin pie a la mode.